When it comes to preliminary data in your R01 grant, there are certain errors that I see fairly commonly in my role as a grant consultant, and that is what we are talking about today. So if you are new around here, my name is Sarah Dobson. I'm a research grant consultant, and my team and I help early career researchers get funded at NIH. So let's talk about what those common errors in your preliminary data and presenting your preliminary data are and how to avoid them. So one of the first things to understand, again, and if you've been following this series on preliminary data, this will be familiar to you, but let's review it again. There are two main roles for preliminary data in your R01 grant. And that is to speak to the scientific premise of the research that you're proposing. And it's also to speak to the feasibility of the research that you are proposing. And it's important, again, that we contextualize those roles for preliminary data when we're talking about the errors, because more often than not, what I see is PIs sort of recognizing one role and not the other, right? And so more commonly, PIs recognize the role of preliminary data in speaking to the feasibility of the research that they're proposing, but they generally don't do a great job speaking to the scientific premise of the work that they're doing. And so what ends up happening is that the preliminary data ends up being used in ways that really do explain the feasibility or argue for the feasibility of the work that's been done, but you haven't done enough to establish why the research needs to be done in the first place and kind of showing your work in terms of how you arrived at that overarching hypothesis. And so the significance of your research can end up falling a bit flat. And that can influence your scores and ultimately your success when it comes to your R01 grant. So I would say that truly the biggest error I see is not fully using the preliminary data to its best ability when it comes to speaking to that scientific premise. And so what that looks like in a grant application is that you haven't done enough to connect your preliminary data to the aims that you are proposing to pursue, right? So even if you do think to use your preliminary data in describing the scientific premise of what you're doing and the significance of what you're doing, you still don't do a good enough job connecting those dots between the work that you've already done and the work that you're proposing to do. And that is essential to the success of your application, because again, what you're really trying to do is show how that preliminary data is informing the development of the work that you are proposing. And so if you kind of leave it up to your reviewers to connect those dots for themselves, if you say, well, here's the preliminary data that's informing our scientific premise, and here are our aims, and you figure it out, that is leaving too much up to your reviewers to do the work for themselves to make that connection and connect those dots. And in my view, the smarter thing to do, the more competitive approach to take would be to make that connection for your reviewers and explain how the work that you've done is informing the development of that central hypothesis and the development of each of your aims to be able to test that central hypothesis, right? So ultimately, what you are trying to do is use your preliminary data in both ways so that you are speaking to the scientific premise of your proposal and speaking to the feasibility. But the feasibility part doesn't really seem to be as big of a challenge for most of the PIs that we work with anyway. And it's really the piece around connecting those dots to really speak to how your previous work connects to your future work, the work that you're proposing. And so my biggest recommendation for you as a viewer is to think about how you can better connect those dots for your readers, for your audience. How does the preliminary research that you've done inform your central hypothesis and inform the development of your aims? And how can you make that as clear and explicit as possible? So if you found that helpful, I strongly encourage you to sign up for our free resource library. It is full of videos and worksheets and other tools to help you write a stronger NIH grant. You can find a link to the resource library in the description underneath this video, and I will see you next time.